Today's session number 5, identifying and monitoring impact, and it's Richard and I returning to deliver this week's session and also session number 6. Okay. So before we crack on, we do something called a pre-session evaluation. I'll see if Richard, could you also post the link in the chat?
Yes, of course, I will.
See if I can do it. Oops.
Should be there now.
All right, thank you very much, Richard.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Yes, if you just click on the link, it's a Microsoft Forms, just a few questions in terms of an evaluation before the session starts. Give you a few minutes to do that. Okay, those of you who just recently joined us, welcome. We're just doing a pre-session evaluation. The link is in the chat. So if you can just click the link and just fill that in, that would be great. And just to also let you know that we're recording the session as some attendees are not able to make it today. And therefore I've requested that we record the session. As I said earlier, if you do not feel comfortable with that, you can switch your camera off. That's absolutely fine. If anyone's having trouble with the forms or not being able to access that, just shout out and just let me know. Right, okay, let's move on. If you've not managed to complete the form, you can just do it whilst we carry on, okay? Okay, I wanted to kind of start today by looking at something that I refer to as the spectrum of mental health support. And sometimes when we ask schools or educational settings to think about the mental health support that we provide, sometimes we kind of look at it from a certain perspective or a certain paradigm. And it's very important that we have this broader understanding of what mental health is. And as part of that broader understanding, there's elements where specialist professionals are very part of that process, especially at one end. But at the very early stages, as educational practitioners, teachers, even teaching assistants, any support staff that you have, community groups, etc., they're all part of the mental health support that we provide. And what I wanted you to do today is just have a think about your environment, but also think about these kind of separate strands of mental health support that would exist within your school, and then think about what elements of this paradigm do you have control over, and then think about the aspects that you do not have much control over. So I think one of the frustrations at this moment in time, which all professions and parents and schools and families are experiencing, is is a referral to external specialist support. And we know post-COVID, the number of children and young people requiring specialist professional expertise and help has increased dramatically, and there seems to be quite long waiting lists in terms of accessing support. But if we look at the mental health paradigm of support that we have within educational settings, that's only one strand. So referral to specialists, external specialist support is the kind of far end of what you would do after having exhausted the previous strands. So if you look at the very early stages, what's really important when we're developing mental health support in educational settings is the kind of early intervention and prevention aspects of it. And I think as leads of kind of mental health within your organizations, I think that's kind of what I'm trying to say to you is there's a lot that you have control over, and there's a lot that you can make a difference. And it's about setting the framework and the foundation for mental health support in your environment. So obviously we talked about in our first session around values and the ethos of your school environment. Training for school, what kind of training do you provide? Your senior leadership team, how much of an emphasis does it give to mental health? That's very early kind of prevention where you're kind of developing your school concepts. Then you have your kind of universal support, and the universal support is kind of what's available for every single child or young person within your establishment. So you may have a curriculum. Within that curriculum, you may have some elements of mental health support, emotional well-being. You may do some work around kind of personal, social, emotional development. So that's kind of the universal, everyone has it. Similarly, you'll have a range of activities available on offer. You'll have break time clubs, lunchtime clubs, after school clubs. That's all benefiting mental health. It's the very early stages of giving children and young people good well-being, giving them purpose, giving them subjects or activities that they're interested in. And you can do a lot of that. Similarly, for the school staff or the educational staff that you support, you may have a lot of things in place for staff well-being. And how well do you look after staff? How well do you support staff members in terms of their workload, in terms of listening to any queries or concerns that they may have? What kind of training do you provide them? All of that falls within your kind of universal support that you have available within your environment, and it's something that you have absolute control over. It's very local. You can meet with your senior leadership teams, you can have discussions, and you can make changes quite quickly. And that's the kind of aspect that I feel as senior mental health leads, that's the kind of element that you should be focusing on. After the kind of universal stage, we're kind of looking at the early identification of needs. And it's very important that you have systems in place where if the universal support isn't working, how quickly do you recognize that this child or young person needs support? And this is absolutely crucial, because if you do this well and you do it quickly, it results in support being provided very quickly, and you end up making a massive difference, and it prevents an escalation of that young person's mental health deteriorating. I'll give you an example. We've been doing some research into children that are, due to their emotional well-being, are not able to attend an educational setting. And what we've found is, looking at some of the data, is when their attendance starts to drop, if we can identify that very quickly and we can put some very early support in place, what seems to happen is their attendance seems to improve, and we end up being more successful. However, once a child is out of a school setting and then has spent a prolonged period of time out of school, then trying to get them back into any form of setting seems to be very difficult. And this is where I'm saying that once mental health deteriorates quite significantly, then we often need specialist support, and we can't then manage it through early intervention or early support. So I think in schools and education settings, we need to have good systems where we can identify needs quite quickly, and how we can intervene quite quickly. And then obviously talking about what early support do you have available in school, which is the kind of fourth strand. There may be services that are available locally that you access, but similarly, there may be services that you buy into. And it might be something that you need to do as an exercise to kind of judge, for this need, we have this support available, but we've not got any counselling support for this cohort of children. What can we do? Can we look at some options for counselling support that we could provide to children and young people. Maybe we could think about getting a play therapist in, and it's about thinking about what your environment needs and making sure you have that early support in schools. And if you do these 4 strands extremely well, it's the 4 things that you have absolute control over, or a large degree of control. Then I think your responsibility for supporting children's mental health, you've kind of achieved that. And that's what this training over the several sessions is trying to kind of achieve, is to give you some tools and give you some knowledge, give you some opportunity to discuss how you could address them kind of early 4 strands in terms of your educational environment. If you do have any questions, I'm more than happy for you to just shout out, either raise your hand digitally. I can only see a few people on screen, or just leave a few comments in the chat. In the next session, we do have a lot more discussion about your context and your school and what you have in place, and you do a lot of kind of sharing with other people within this group to kind of see what they have in place, and then we end up developing a plan that you can action in terms of next steps in terms of mental health support in your school environment. Okay, and this is very similar. It's not too dissimilar to what I've kind of described. Again, the point that I'm trying to make, which is the most important one, is it's a spectrum. Mental health support, emotional well-being, whatever we want to call it, it's on a continuum. It's on a spectrum, and we just need to kind of have that conceptualization in our mind. And if you have that conceptualization, it kind of does help, because when you are presented with kind of a challenge within your school environment in terms of what you need to do in terms of mental health, you can think of it as part of this spectrum. Where do we need to focus our energy? Where do we need to kind of target our support? What are we doing so well? Which area are we doing it very well in? What areas can we improve? And that's what I'm trying to kind of get across to you. And what the evidence says is that mental health interventions are more successful when we provide early intervention and early targeted treatment. The chances of mental health improving at that stage is kind of the best time to do it. Obviously, one of the challenges is educational settings, unfortunately, over the last few years have kind of been an environment where a lot of services that were available to support families and schools, they kind of eroded over time, and that's been one of the challenges. The government is trying to address some of that through the family hubs rollout that they are doing nationally, and there's a couple of groups within Lancashire that are kind of trialing that at this moment in time, and we do have a family hubs team, and hopefully that will kind of replace some of the services that were lost during kind of the last few years. Lancashire also has a children and family wellbeing service that kind of provides other elements of the universal kind of support, or even some bit of selective support, as well as other services. So again, if you just look at this continuum, we can see a lot of it's early intervention. So you have your universal approaches, as I talked about, selective or targeted approaches. Indicated is more kind of individual. So you're kind of moving away from early prevention towards the kind of early intervention. It's very important that you identify very quickly and provide early treatment. It's probably after this point, after what you've done targeted and maybe some individualized work within your environment, that's where the split arises, where you probably require, if them approaches have not been successful and they haven't improved a person's mental health, it's probably at that point you need to identify referrals to other more specialist services. Okay, fantastic. It's snowing outside, great. We've got the cycle. So again, what I was saying to you was about identification, and early identification is very important. And I think the first kind of conceptualization that I wanted to give you is about where you would target your support and how generally mental health support would look within an organization. This is more about you can apply this model to your overall school, but you can also apply it to individual cases where individual children and young people are not coping so well. And as you can see, the first step is to make sure that you notice, you observe, and that's kind of early identification, recognizing the signs. Once you recognize that, the next step is to kind of assess, look at it deeper, explore it a bit more. Once you've explored it, once you've tried to attempt to understand a deeper understanding, the kind of third step is to kind of then understand what's going on for this child or young person, trying to make some kind of sense of it. In psychology, we call it hypothesis testing. So you notice something and you think, oh, something's going on here. Then you assess, you explore it a bit more. During that phase, you're testing several hypotheses. Why is this child doing this? Is it because of this? Is it because of that? Is it because that's changed? And you're creating hypotheses or guesses in terms of why this child or young person is not coping. And that phase is very crucial. It's very important in making sure then what you do afterwards is kind of targeted. So the logical step after that is then once you think, okay, child A's behavior is escalating because the family experienced a marital breakdown, and that's your hypothesis, that's your guess. So once you have that understanding, then you can do some targeted intervention in relation to that. And you might think you might provide some key adult support, or maybe some check-ins with the key adult, or some pastoral support, some mentoring support. That's the kind of very early phases. You would then review it. It's a cyclical process. You have to keep going round and round. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to follow in a logical order. Sometimes you might just notice something and you think, okay, that makes sense, and therefore we're going to do this. Similarly, whilst you're intervening, whilst you're doing something, you're also assessing to see whether that's useful or whether it's working, and you might change the initial hypothesis or guess that you had about this young person. Okay, we briefly talked about this in my earlier session, Bronfenbenner's ecological systems or theory, which kind of says that the child is at the center and the child is interacting with several factors. You've got very immediate factors that are very close to the child. So on the diagram, the child's kind of like a reddy orange color. The kind of immediate systems are the things in yellow. These are kind of the ones that you have the most control over, and then the system goes wider, and then you've got the meso, exo, maxo, and chronal system, and we get into kind of quite distal factors that may be impacting children and young people. But when we're thinking about individual children and we're trying to identify what's going on for them, and we're trying to assess and trying to understand why their mental health or emotional well-being may not be great, the first thing that we need to be mindful of is what's important in this child's or young person's life, and what kind of areas do we need to kind of explore a bit more. So, we would be looking, if a child's not doing so well in school, we would be asking questions about the school environment. What's going on with the school? How's he doing? Or how is she doing? Or how are they doing in the school environment? How are they getting on with their peers? Has there been any change in the family environment? Is there anything going on, anything else in the community going on? And it's kind of judging that. Sometimes the kind of more exosystem factors might be very important. So, there might be something on the media, something they've seen on social media, which it's kind of quite has resonated with them quite well, and it's had an emotional impact on them. We kind of saw that with the Black Lives Matters movement, where there was a lot of social media around that, and a lot of children and young people, especially from ethnic minorities, were quite profoundly impacted by that. And that's not the kind of micro-meso system. That was something that was so much broader. So as a professional, what you're trying to do is you're trying to identify in this kind of ecological system that I've shown you on screen, what bits of these are important, what bits do we know very well, what bits do we need to explore? So just kind of think about that whilst you kind of attempting to understand, assess or understand what's going on for a child or young person. And we also need to think about, so we can think about what areas potentially may be important to this child's life, and we can explore that. But similarly, we can look at what individual factors are important. And Richard talked about a bit about risk and resilience earlier on. As part of trying to understand how we support children and young people in the early phases of supporting a child or young person in your setting, it's very important to kind of do this kind of risk resilience informal assessment, because that information is then going to help you determine how you can then move forward and how you can then support. So, for example, there's a lot of individual risk factors. So maybe a child's not accessing any of the learning, and therefore they're failing in academic tasks. They're not paying attention in the classroom. They may be hyperactive in the classroom. They may have some specific learning difficulties. They may have dyslexia. They may have dyscalculia. Their personality or temperament might be a risk factor. They might get angry very quickly. So it's about recognizing that. But there's also kind of resilience factors. You know, a child may have, good humor. They may have good communication skills. They may be very knowledgeable or skilled in one particular area. So we can then use resilient factors to kind of support that child or young person. And just be mindful of this side, that these are some of the things that we can identify. The risk factors are areas which you think, okay, this is the issue that we're having. This is a child's individual risk factors. What can we do to support this child to kind of support their well-being in school? Okay, and there's family risk factors, parental ill health, family bereavement, family breakdown. You know, sometimes there may be other social care related type of issues that can have a big impact on a young person's kind of well-being. But there's also kind of family resilience factors, at least one good parent-child relationship. The one parent may be kind of putting in boundaries very well, the communication, the kind of support, the love and affection. That kind of element of it can be really useful. I'll give you a very brief example. I was involved in a very challenging case where a child was out of school or had very minimal attendance. And when I'm involved, I'm doing a very similar thing. I'm looking at what are the risk factors, what are resilient factors, what factors can I use to kind of help this child get back into school. And it was a difficult family relationship. Parents had kind of separated, and one parent was kind of not happy with the school and didn't really want to send the child in because of the support that's kind of perceived to be provided. The other parent was pushing to get the child back into school, felt education was very important. So in that scenario, I recognize the risk factor, but I also recognize a supportive factor. And I wouldn't say either parent was wrong, but there was elements of each parent that were really useful. One was around kind of accommodating that child's mental health and supporting them, which was really needed. But similarly, what was also needed is there was some clarity and consistency and support. And in that moment, I was trying to make judgments in terms of what's important and what's going to help that child. And similarly, in the early phases of school support, that's something else that you should be doing, is kind of looking at individual factors, looking at family risk factors. Are there any resilient factors, or are there any things that you can do at an individual level or at a family level that would help you to kind of support that child or young person? There's community factors. Again, we need to look at these factors to see if there's any associated risk. And if there's an associated risk, can we do something about that? Similarly, is there a community resilience factor that we can use to good effect to allow us to kind of support our child's mental health? I had a very recent case where um, in the community, the young person was associating with an older group of children who, most people would not consider to be an appropriate peer group, and that was having a massive impact on that child's kind of well-being and mental health and how they were functioning on a day-to-day basis. So that was a risk that we identified, and then we kind of targeted maybe possibly we could do something around this. Similarly, there's resilience factors. A child I was working with very recently attends the cadets, and he wants to be a pilot, he wants to be in the Air Force, wants to do something with the military. And that seemed to be the only factor at this moment that was giving him some kind of good feeling, something that he enjoyed, whereas everything else wasn't going so well. So we kind of use that element to kind of see what we can do to kind of use that to kind of support him in other environments. So I've kind of talked about so the very early thing that I talked about is looking at mental health support across a spectrum. So there's a lot of things that you can do, early intervention, prevention, systemic stuff that you can do. Then having systems for early identification, recognition, and having systems for early support is very important as part of senior mental health leads. When things go wrong, I talked about a cycle of support. So noticing, then trying to understand or doing some kind of assessment to understand, and then intervening. When doing that process, it's very important that we look at the wider system. So what factors are important and are impacting this child and young person? We talked about looking at individual factors or individual risk and resilience. We talked about family risk and resilience. We talked just now about community risk and resilience. And what the kind of research says, and even my experience is all of this is interrelated. A lot of these things can go wrong, or they may not be going well, but a child or young person is actually okay. It's when several factors all interlinked. And if you see this Venn diagram, it's kind of talks about circles of vulnerability. So you've got the individual in one circle, you've got the environment and the context in another circle, and then you've got some adversity or life events or something that's happened that's quite significant as another circle. And what I'm trying to kind of say to you is in each of these areas, there's risk and there's resilience. And sometimes in life, you can experience adversity, you can experience some kind of life event, but you may have some very strong individual resilience. You may have a very supportive home environment or a family environment, and you manage the adversity of your life very well. And I think sometimes it's important to kind of think about this from your own personal life or your own personal perspective. So I think what I want you to think about is how things overlap and how maybe at one moment in your life you managed it well, but maybe at another moment in your life you didn't manage well and your mental health dropped. And try and think about why did you manage it so well maybe when it happened a while ago, and maybe why when your mental health did drop, why did you not manage it so well? And it's kind of this element of things overlap, and when we have challenges, sometimes we deal with them and we just get on with it. But sometimes in life, we feel that we could not, and it's at that point our mental health or well-being starts to kind of deteriorate. So I think the next slide is, you can either think of it from your own perspective. Sometimes I find it easier to think about it from my own perspective, but maybe think about it from any children or young people that you work with. Think about what we've talked about: individual risk and resilience. Talk about factors impacting children and young people, and maybe you could put it in the chat, or maybe just shout out a situation where you felt you've looked at a few different factors and you've realized, how what's important for this child or young person, and then therefore you began to kind of intervene immediately. I don't know if that made that very clear. So we just kind of, what I've covered over the last few slides, try and apply it, either the circles of vulnerability, either the risk factors, the different levels of kind of risk and resilience factors, and see if you've ever applied that in a case, or even your personal life. If there's a situation that's happened in your life where you've not coped well, just have a think about, why did you not cope well? Was it an individual reason? Was it because there was the environment of support wasn't there? Was it a mixture of things that all came together? That's why you didn't cope. I'll just give people maybe five or 10 minutes to kind of think about that. If you can, put a few things in the chat, or if you do want to kind of share, that'd be great. If you don't, that's absolutely fine too. Hi, Gary. We talked about ecological systems theory, so about different levels that impact children and young people. The immediate environment, the more distal environment that may be impacting children and young people. We talked about individual risk factors and resilience factors, so these are very important. Some of these can escalate issues. Sometimes we can use these factors to kind of help children and young people. It's kind of family factors that are very important. They may make their mental health worse, or we could use some factors to kind of support their mental health. Similarly, the community may or may not. So some people have very good community links. Some people don't have great community links. So in them kind of situations, it's very important to kind of evaluate that and see if there's anything there that's a risk or resilience. And one of the important things that I talked about is circles of vulnerability. Not every child who experiences the same event responds the same way, and it's very complex because several factors interplay with each other. And I think as senior mental health leads, what I'm asking is that we review the information, we kind of look at different areas, we see what areas are having a big impact, what seems to be a critical area, and where can we target some early support. All right, fantastic. We have some comments. Senko saying, I think normally coping is easier when you know you will be listened to, even if there is nothing anybody can do to help. When you feel in control of some element, and when you can see an end in sight, without these things, it can be overwhelming. That's an excellent point. Sometimes, you know, one of the factors is who do you have in your immediate environment that can listen to you? And when typically all people are experiencing mental health, what the research says is sometimes they just want to talk to someone, for someone to listen. And a lot of the times I found 90% of the time, there's nothing that we can do about it. And probably the worst thing that you can do in that moment is to start giving advice and say, oh, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Why don't you do that? Because that doesn't help, because they're not in that state at that moment in time. All they really require is a listening type of ear, someone that they can talk to, and someone just listens. And to be honest, you know, my mental health goes up and down, but because I've got a good family network, and people close to me, sometimes I'm rambling on, or I'm talking to either to my friends or my wife or my parents or whoever, and I'm expressing some of my frustrations, and they're just listening. And for me, that's quite therapeutic in itself, just being to kind of get it out of my mind and just express it. And that ensures that overall my mental health stays quite stable. But I can imagine that if I didn't have that network, some things that I experience on a day-to-day basis or some event that happens, I may not deal with it well if I do not have that environment of support. And the same thing goes for children. Do they have someone that they have a bond with that they can open up to, or are they very isolated? And if they're very isolated, that's a risk factor in terms of something that's going to increase or their mental health kind of deteriorating. So that's a very good point that you make. And that's why counselling is very effective. It's very person-centered. It's about just being able to talk to someone. And most counsellors that I've worked with are person-centered. So they do the Rogerian type of counselling where you don't really give that much advice. You just kind of reaffirm, rephrase. You do a lot of acting listening. You do a lot of shared body language. And that's why counselling seems to work for a lot of people. The head teacher is saying that we've got a child who arrived to us from another school. He doesn't feel safe here yet, and that shows up in the way that he behaves, which has been challenging. He has some additional needs, and we needed to factor in that too. So already, just in that paragraph, you're doing that evaluation. You notice something. You're doing some hypothesis testing. It's possibly because of this. Home life is challenging. Including a separation and a nasty breakup, that is less in the picture. So again, you're doing some hypothesis generating that it could be this might be a big factor, and then you're targeting some early support. So early morning check-ins, that's an excellent strategy. It's kind of helping to develop a bond, someone for the child to talk to, also doing a check-in, that's great. And you've kind of judged that what this child needs at this moment in time is a safe space and to make that child feel safe. So that's very good. And that couple of paragraphs or short paragraph is essentially what I'm asking you to do is when something happens, is notice it, try to do some assessment. It doesn't have to be formal assessment. It's just thinking about what it could be. Maybe it's this, maybe it's that. How's this going? How's that going? And then trying to understand what it means, trying to okay, this child is not coping because I think it's this. This child is not coping because they don't feel safe. There's no safety at home. There's no safety in school. What can I then do to support this child to feel safe? And if you do that really well, that child will eventually start feeling safe and will start enjoying school and it'll prevent it from escalating. But if you didn't do that, then there's a very good chance that it escalates. The child's out of school, the situation gets much worse, and then it's very hard to then support that child or young person. Okay. Beverly said, struggle to separate each event. I don't know what you mean by that. I'm happy to discuss that if you want to just shout out, maybe expand on it a bit more. We've got Helen that says relationships and support network, the availability of a person to listen empathically, and actively, and for that to be consistent and reliable. That's very important. Yeah, you're right, Catherine. There's so many risk factors. What should we prioritize? And I think all I ask school professionals, educational professionals is we're not expecting educational settings to address everything. What do you have control over? What can you make a difference about? And let's just focus on that. And if you do that bit well, I have no doubt that it'll have some impact. And I always focus on quality over quantity, and especially around mental health support. If we can provide quality support, that's way better than providing lots of support that doesn't do much. And that's what Helen says. It's consistent and it's reliable, and it's the quality of it. There are significant issues within our local community, so massive community factors that social behaviour impacts mental health dramatically. It's very challenging for children who are mixed up into this, yeah. And you're absolutely right. And then as schools or educational settings, we have to then kind of manage that. And that can be a challenge, and there needs to be something more systemic around that, and not only from educational settings, from the community in itself and other support services. Challenging thoughts and supporting them to find a sense of belonging. Lynn talks about a year 3 child who are responsible for his younger siblings, young carers, child protection plan, child safety in school. And that's very important. The environment outside of school can't be great, but the environment in school can be everything. And this is why I say to schools, when I'm involved in a lot of cases, sometimes a lot of frustrations about something happening in the home or something happening in the community. And I always say that we can't really change that, but we don't have as much control over that. What do we have control over? What can we do in school? And I think if you do that within a school environment or education environment, what you can control, I think that is good enough in terms of supporting children and young people. Kathleen talks about a champion network in school, children and scientists checking in on an ad hoc basis, developing relationships. Yeah, and Kathleen, that's what we're going to talk about later, is having conversations with children and young people, and having that relationships helps you then identify and understand much more at a deeper level. If you don't have that bond, what will then happen is when things go wrong, you're trying to find out what's going on, but the child or young person is not willing to explain, or even talk to school professionals. And this is where I talked about that early intervention support, is if we can get the support in where all children have someone in school that they have access to, or someone that they have a bond with, or in the very early stages to develop that relationship. When things then do escalate, we can then kind of intervene quite quickly. And Helen talks about exploring what's at the root. And that's absolutely what I'm asking you to do, is do that exploration. And when we attempt to identify what's going wrong for children, we have to explore a bit more deeply. Fantastic, thank you very much. Okay, so that's, just think about this cycle again. I've kind of briefly alluded to it. We're noticing something going wrong or something may not be okay. We're attempting to explore that a bit more deeper. So, it's assess on this cycle, but exploration could be another or better word. And then the third phase is attempting to understand, and then we intervene, and then we review. So the first step is identification through noticing and observation. And this is the very first stage. And this is what we see. This is where people raise concerns, or this is where people think there may be something going on for this child or young person. And, just making sure that within your school system, we'll talk about this in a later session, but it's about having a planned approach when someone does identify or notice through observation. How do we address it? Sometimes what seems to happen is a staff member will notice something, and in that moment they'll think, okay, there's something going on, but then there's not a real system to then just monitor that. And then maybe a few weeks later, a month or two after, something goes wrong, and then the staff member says, I did recognize that a few months ago, that something was going on. It was a bit different, or she was a bit different. So what do we observe? What do we notice? It's, and I think school professionals are always the first to kind of notice, are there any changes in behavior? Is there something that's kind of not typical for this child or young person? Are they tired? Are they more tired than normal? Has their appearance changed? In terms of their academic work, has their engagement changed? Are they not socializing as much? Has their physical health changed? Have their eating patterns changed? Has their attendance been affected? Are they taking joy in doing activities? Are they saying to others that they're not feeling great? Are they talking more about headaches? Are they off school because of health issues more often? Are you seeing more fight or flight type of behaviors? And I think what I'm saying here is just kind of noticing them early signs. It's not yourselves as senior mental health leads doing this. It's making sure that every staff member within your environment is able to do this, and that there's a system to then share that information and just to monitor that information, because that's the early support and it's the early recognition that something is not happening as it should be, and therefore we need to do something. I want to show this diagram, which is the iceberg kind of model that we talk about in psychology. So when we're observing and noticing, what I talked about in the previous slide is what we are seeing at the surface. We only see the presentation. We do not see what's behind that presentation. So when you observe and notice, you might see a child running away from the school environment or the classroom, or you might see a child, a young person threatening someone. That's what we're seeing. We don't know why they're doing that. We're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. And that's the first phase, that we notice it and we observe it. So that's kind of stage one. The second stage and the third stage, as I've talked about, is to then explore that a bit more deeper, maybe do some kind of assessment around it, whether it's formal or informal. And then after that is then we try to kind of intervene. So just keep that in mind, that kind of model. So the first step is kind of obviously noticing. The second step is then to kind of explore that a bit more. So in the second phase, it's very important that we do a person-centered holistic exploration. We keep the child or young person at the center. We involve them as much as they can. We elicit their views as much as possible. And in this phase, we want to gather more information. So we've noticed something. Let's gather more information rather than trying to do something very quickly or trying to intervene. Let's just try and explore it at a more deeper level. And the best way to kind of do this is to involve the child or young person, maybe through someone who has a trusting bond with them, to get their views, to kind of ask them what's going on. And that will give you a lot of information in itself. Not only do we obtain information from one person, ask other teachers that interact with that young person or other staff and get their perspectives. Talk to parents, talk to carers, talk to other professionals and see what they say. And what you're doing is getting multiple perspectives. And then we'll kind of be using you can use some questionnaires or screening tools. We'll talk about that from other people. In school, you have a lot of other information. So you have attendance information, you have your kind of progress trackers, attitude to learning, etc. Again, that's all important information that you can then use to kind of understand what's going on for a child or young person better. So at this phase, as I said, you've noticed something, you want to explore it a bit more, you want to dig a bit deeper into what's going on, get a few different perspectives, and then you've got this bulk of information now in front of you, and that's where you start begin to make some judgments, understand what's going on, and then you have a better understanding. So you're kind of doing this to create a better understanding of a child or young person. I'll come back to this if I get a chance, or we'll talk about this in a later session. I've put some links here, and hopefully Richard did pass these through as a link. I'll open one up to kind of show you, if he allows me to. Okay. And I think one of the actions will be, let's see if I can open that one. If you go to this website, the link is in the PowerPoint. I could put it in the chat, which might make life easier. So these are some kind of tools that have been developed with the kind of Anna Freud National Center for Children and Young People and Families. And this is a toolkit that was developed similarly with them, but delegated by Public Health England. Just putting the link. At that phase where you do the initial noticing, then you do a bit of informal exploration, talking to people, looking at some data or information that you hold. You may then think that you want to do something formal. You don't necessarily have to, but you might feel that it might be a bit useful to do. And there's a range of measures here on this website. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it might be something that you want to look at during the week before our next session. And you might select a questionnaire from here that you think might be important in monitoring your intervention or understanding the child a bit more. So, for example, if there's been a significant life event in that child's life, you might do an assessment such as this kind of scale that looks at an impact of an event. If a child's having some kind of eating needs, you might do an eating disorder questionnaire. If you think it's anxiety, you might do something around anxiety. There's a few here. They're not many of these might not be appropriate, but you can also use these to kind of explore how a child may be feeling or some of their views in a more structured manner. So there's the me and my feelings questionnaire. There's a mood and feelings questionnaire, which you could use. So there's a raft of tools that you could use here just to kind of explore the situation a bit more. And there's some instructions on how to use it and some considerations that you need to have. There's one for parents. There's one for kind of a child's attitude to kind of school. So just have a look at these kind of questionnaires and see whether there's any that you feel you may want to use in an individual case to explore the case a bit more. Similarly, this toolkit is fantastic. There are a raft of kind of measures. It kind of goes through a lot of things that we've discussed today and also in other sessions. But if I just go down, and it gives some example of good practice. So there's primary schools, what they have in place, and it might be useful if you're a primary school to go through this booklet and look at what other schools are doing. And seeing how you compare and whether there's some knowledge there that you can kind of take forward. What I wanted to show you was this element here. So the index of instruments. And it tells you the measures. A lot of these measures are free to use. Some you have to pay for, you have to kind of pay a nominal charge. But it tells you what age range, who would be responding, whether it's free to use or whether it's kind of charging. And it kind of just goes through all of them. It tells you which areas that it kind of assesses. So it's, is it family relationships? Is it health? Is it well-being? Is it coping? And I'm not saying you would use this all the time, but I think as an organization and especially a senior mental health lead, it would be worthwhile going through the website and the documents, looking at some of the measures and thinking, actually, that's a tool or a measure that we can use within an organization when things start going wrong for a child or young person, or that's a tool that we're going to use to kind of track how well a young person may be doing. And just having this toolkit available, something that's personalized to your school, that's very useful. So that's all I'll ask you to do is maybe when you get some time, hopefully over the coming week, just kind of go through these documents and see if there's anything within there that you feel that you could potentially use within your environment. Okay. And I've kind of briefly mentioned this is when you do use these kind of measures, just kind of think about why you're using it. You need to understand why you're using a tool. Is it appropriate to use that tool? Who's going to complete the tool? Is it a parent? Is it a child? Is it a staff member? Also think about if you are going to get a child or young person or family to complete a questionnaire, where will you do it? At what time? Will it be a safe space? Will it be quiet? Will it be private? Also, after they've done the kind of questionnaire, how are you going to communicate back to parents? How are you going to communicate back to children and young people? The other couple of things that you need to be wary of is how are you going to store this information? And you'll have your own processes around that. And similarly, whether you have consent to do that. So, every step of the phase, make sure you're engaging with parents, carers, and children and young people and gaining their consent before you do anything. Okay. So just kind of have a think of that. I think next week, I think it's next week, the final session. We do a bit more of that. It's a bit more practical next session. Richard and I have tried to do these sessions where this session we just try and give you as much information as we can. So you have the overall understanding and a gist of what we're trying to say to you. The next session is a bit more specific and a bit more targeted, okay? This just gives an example of how you could use 2 or 3 measures together to kind of aid overall understanding. That's not so important. The most important point that I'm trying to make is this concept of triangulation. So you're getting information from different areas and you're kind of combining all of that information. And your goal is to understand that child or young person better. The better we understand what's going on for a child or young person, the intervention that we then do is more targeted and is more likely to be effective. If we don't understand what's going on, and if we don't do a good triangulation, we'll have an understanding of a child or young person that's wrong or inaccurate. And then what happens is when we try to do something, it doesn't work. And because it doesn't work because we've not got the best understanding, and that's where we fail. So that's the kind of thing that I want you to just kind of understand a bit more. Is what we're hoping to do is you notice what's going on, explore the situation as deep as we can, and then have a better understanding. And once we have this better understanding, that's where we can then intervene. And I think the analogy that I use is like, let's say you're a mechanic and the car's not working, and the car's not starting. So the mechanic has this kind of understanding, and they may have some knowledge that the starter motor for the car may be faulty. So that's their kind of understanding. They might do some kind of assessment. So they might go and look at the starter motor. They might do some electrical testing on the starter motor. And then they'll think, okay, I think it's the starter motor, and they'll do it. And, the car may not start after that, because that maybe the mechanic has just looked at one thing and it's just the starter motor. He's not considered other things. And it might not be the starter motor. It might be the battery. The battery may be flat, and that's why the car's not starting. It might be the engine's immobilizer, and that's why the car's not starting. And a mechanic who's a good one, what he'll do is, rather than making a judgment very quickly, he'll do a bit of an initial exploration. Could it be the starter motor? Is it a battery? Is it a immobilizer? Has the car got any fuel in? And that's what I'm asking you to do with children and young people. You notice that something's gone awry. What shall we do? Let's explore a bit more. Is it this? Is it that? Let's ask this person. Let's ask that person. Let's look at factors in the individual. Let's look at factors in the community. And thereafter, then make a judgment in terms of what you think is going on for a child or young person. Much harder when we're dealing with humans and children and young people. But just to have an initial evaluation in terms of what your understanding is, and then moving forward. So that process of triangulation is very important. That will ensure that any intervention that you do is purposeful, is well researched, is well evidenced in that what you've attempted to find out, and then it's well targeted. And if you do that process and you have the measures in your school environment, education environment for kind of obtaining that information, then you'll be able to do that early intervention much better. Okay, fantastic. So kind of, I'll just provide a very quick summary of what we kind of discussed this first half of the session. We've talked about mental health support in school being a spectrum. We've talked about focusing on what you have control over, early intervention prevention, and also having some early systems in place for recognizing and early support. We talked about noticing when things go wrong, or if there are changes, and having systems to kind of recognize that quite quickly, and then doing some deeper exploration. And we might do that exploration by talking, by exploring other perspectives, or maybe doing some structured assessment through the tools that I described. The final stage is just kind of triangulating that information and developing that better understanding. And hopefully at the end of that stage, we will then kind of intervene and do something targeted for that challenging person. And that's kind of one cycle that I've kind of gone through. You would obviously then review and then start that cycle again. And it's very similar to what's defined within the SEN Code of practice as what we would describe as a graduated type of approach. Okay, fantastic. We'll have a break now, and then Richard does the second half of the session. Richard, I was just wondering whether a 10-minute break or a 15-minute break?
Let's have 15. I think
Okay.
We are slightly ahead of time, aren't we? So that's good. So yeah, let's have 15 minutes. So come back 10:50 and I will start for the second half. Thanks, everyone.
Fantastic. See everyone at 10:50. Yes. Hello.
Hi, everybody. Okay, so we're going to kick off with part 2. I'm going to first make a quick apology that I'm struggling a little bit with a cold, so if I have to pause or I go croaky or I cough, then that's I'm sorry, that is why. Okay, so the second half, I'm going to follow up on quite a bit that Ish has introduced, and I guess take you through a process of the topic of the session, really, which is about sort of identifying need and thinking about interventions and what might be appropriate in terms of trying to support an issue or a young person. And we're going to think of this model, which if you come to some of our team's training before, you may have seen before. But what I really want you to think about with this is putting yourself, well, you are in the position, but keeping in mind your role as the mental health lead. So not only using this thinking for yourself, but also how you might share this way of thinking with colleagues, or encourage other people to use this way of thinking, which I guess is trying to draw out a process of recognizing that's an issue and going through a process to then thinking about what might be our response to that issue, and taking our time over that. I guess not jumping to a conclusion based on other children we might have met, based on our personal biases or judgments, or even based on what we've seen before, because you know, everybody's unique, every situation is unique, and the hypotheses or theories about why some things happen are likely to change over time as children get older, or they're in different contexts or have different influences upon them. So I know I'm labouring the point a little bit, but I guess what I'm saying is it's important, I think, to think about this process and encourage this kind of process for other people thinking, rather than jumping to a conclusion of a child did that and therefore it must be this and therefore we must do this. Okay, so I'm going to cover these in more detail, but just to, I guess, go through this process. We imagine we've got a issue, a problem, a concern about a young person, and the first question is really, what is that? What is the problem? Again, without jumping to a conclusion of based on perhaps I've seen this before and I know what it is, I know what this is all about. And some of the things that Ish was introducing, showing in terms of the, for instance, the measures that we could use can be really useful at understanding what is this problem, what is the thing that we're trying to understand here. Is it what we think it is? And, you know, think about that iceberg model, that things on the surface can look one way, but actually what's under the surface is something else. And we can be more effective when we understand what that something else is and address that. So what's the problem? How do we understand what the problem is? What's the effect of the problem on the child's life or on the lives of others? Really helpful to linger with that a little bit and understand that well. Okay, so we maybe we have an understanding of the problem, and then on the next, I guess, few questions are about understanding that problem in the context of that particular young person, their life, their history, their current context. So why them? Why does, so let's imagine, and I'm going to show you a case study in a little while, and I have put a so there's a link in the chat which hopefully should let you download the case study, but I've also emailed it to you all. So the case study, which is essentially around anxiety. So if we're thinking, if we did some work and felt like, right, I understand this problem for this young person, this is about anxiety, asking why them? Why does that person have this problem and not the person who sits next to them in class, for instance? What are the risks for them. Risks is a strong word, but I guess thinking about that stuff Ish was showing earlier, it's a way of understanding what might increase a person's vulnerability to having a specific problem. And we've all got them. We've all got some vulnerabilities. So what are their vulnerabilities? And that might be tracking way back in their history, if that's helpful. But also why now? Why are we thinking about this young person now as opposed to last month or last school year? Is there something that has triggered this problem now that is significant and important for us to think about in terms of wanting to respond to it? And with this, I always want people to recognise this might not be a significant life event that we know about. And that's not because we don't know about it. It might be a small accumulation of things which have just got to the point where this problem is kind of triggered or becomes worse. Okay. So alongside, I guess, risk factors and potentially triggering factors, there's also, I guess, something useful about thinking, why doesn't it get better? You know, we all have ups and downs in our lives. We all have, if we think about anxiety, we all have anxieties. We'll all have things that stress us or worry us, but we tend to end up coping with them and getting on with life somehow. So for someone where we're recognizing actually that isn't happening, what are those barriers to improvement? What's stopping them coping or improving? Is it something they're doing? Is it something in the context? Is it something in their relationships with other people? Is it something someone else is doing that actually is kind of inadvertently, not necessarily deliberately, but stopping them improving or coping? And finally, and certainly not least, what might help them? What do we know about them that should be strengths rather than individual? What are their strengths? What resiliency factors are there? And I'll talk in a couple of minutes about what we mean by resiliency factors and some models around resilience. Okay. So I'm going to just expand on some of those a little bit. Firstly, thinking about the problem. When we're trying to define, and you might not even want to call it problem, I guess that's just a word that we use to think about a challenge or an issue. Some people might not think there is a problem. So even before we sort of finalize our thinking on what's the problem and what might we call it or what is it, recognizing that there may well be multiple perspectives on that problem, and that that's not necessarily always a bad thing, but those perspectives might differ, and because of that might affect how we want to collect some information once we've noticed that there's a problem. So, you know, there are some advantages of having multiple perspectives and trying to get information from different places, I guess what I'm saying. So there's advantages to talking to the child or children, because they are the ones with the minds, you know, they are the ones experiencing the difficulties. And it's important or advantageous to talk to them and work with them, because they might not be able to easily describe or verbalize their experience. They might need a structure. They might need an adult to help them do that. You know, young children are probably not going to come and talk to you and say, I have a problem with anxiety. You know, but we might see that all the time. So the advantage of working with a child or trying to help understand the child's perspective is they might not be able to tell us. We might need to give them some structure, whether that's a conversation, a questionnaire, more of a creative way of expressing themselves, maybe through drawing, for instance. But there are some I'm not going to call them disadvantages. I guess there's some biases in there, in that they may not think there's a problem. They may not want to have a problem. They might want to deny or minimize, you know, if they felt shamed or criticised, told off for this problem. And they might not have, I've already said about verbalizing, they might, depending on their age or their ability level, might not have the kind of metacognitive skills to think about their thinking. So we might see someone who might be really struggling with anxiety, which might be about their thinking, they're predicting the worst, imagining terrible things are going to happen and that's stopping them doing stuff, but they might not be able to recognize that for themselves. They might not think about their thinking. They might just be thinking the worst is going to happen. That's just a fact of life, and so I can't go there, I can't go to school, I can't do that. Okay. So there's the child's perspective, then there's your perspective, which I've lumped together as school, but obviously even within a school there are going to be multiple perspectives depending on who knows the child and who knows the family, etc. But if we put all those people together, you know, the advantage you have is you see hundreds of children, thousands of children. You kind of know this is typical, this is not typical. So you can compare their experience against many others, and you can see the child in certain situations, you know, under challenge, academically or physically, or with peers, what they're like when it's very structured, what they're like when it's very unstructured. So you have the advantage of seeing the child in several different contexts. You know, and again, if we think about anxiety, where might these problems come out? Where might the child actually show quite a lot of competence and achieve success? Nobody, even with very significant anxiety problems, nobody spends 100% of their time sitting with anxiety. You know, it goes away, it comes and goes for everybody. So where is it? Where does it come? Where does it go? Your biases, I guess, are you don't see the child in other contexts outside school or at home, and there may be things that have happened to them that you are not aware of because no one's told you. Historical, family, community influences. You know, you can only know that stuff if people say it. And you know, I guess a final bias is, which I think we can overcome, like I said before, with creative means, is, you know, we may be relying on verbal skills and cognitive skills, which might not get at a true understanding of that child's experience. And I guess the final perspective is parents, carers, family. And I suppose I'd see this as, in some ways, not opposite, but complementary to yours. You know, they know that child's history. They know how the young person has been, you know, in other settings, if they've been to a different school, if they've been to preschool or nursery. But their biases are they don't see that child at school. They may only see that child in certain peer situations with family or with friends, not necessarily in conflict, for instance, or big groups, etc. So I guess what I'm again labouring the point a little bit, but recognising everyone's got a perspective on here of an issue here, and they are all complementary. Okay, they all help us understand what is this problem that we're trying to understand better or respond to. Okay. So that was problem on that model. The next bit of that model was about vulnerability and why them. So we've talked about this. We're going to have I'm going to give you some group time to have a practice at this. It's recognizing those circles of vulnerability that exist for all of us. You know, we all have potentially some things that go in these circles, some of us more than others. You know, you could even imagine these circles have different sizes for different people. You know, how big or small are the adversity vulnerabilities, for instance, for someone, or the context and environment ones. Okay. And thinking about what keeps the problem going, again, we've talked about this. This is where one place where that thinking about the Bronfenbrenner model and the different concentric circles of influence matter. because there could be influences from lots of different layers on what might keep the problem going. Okay. Again, sticking with the theme of anxiety, are there things in someone's exosystem, just looking at, I need my glasses on, are there things in a broader system, are there things individually in the child themselves or their microsystem? Hope that kind of makes sense, but you know, what might keep the problem going? Well, how much do other people understand this problem? How much do they potentially contribute to the problem? You know, if it's anxiety, how much are people allowed to avoid something because their anxiety is great? How much are they forced to do something that they don't want to do that causes anxiety and doesn't help them cope? How much might be, you know, are there some individual factors such as there's an ongoing health problem that means that certain things in life are more difficult and then are contributing to that anxiety? So keeping that idea in mind that we all have ups and downs, we never have the problem around us 100% of the time. It comes and goes. What helps it come? What helps it go? What makes it stick around? Again, we'll have a look. I'll get you to have a think about this in the case study in a couple of minutes. And then the last bit of that model was what helps. What might be a person's strengths that would help them cope with those circles of vulnerability, for instance. There's a load of different models around resilience, and I'm just going to show you two here. And I can't help but sort of give a shameless plug for some of the training we do. We do a training session on resilience, which talks about these models a bit more. Sorry, Ish, plugging our service. You're happy for you to do the same. But just very briefly, like this is one model of resilience that thinks about an individual person and gives us a few areas where we could think about their resiliency skills, what might help them cope. So this is very much research based and kind of tells us what helps us build resiliency skills to cope with challenges are having positive thinking, being able to self-regulate and manage stress, having a good relationship engagement with school or college, engaging in activities. This model talks about physical activities, and I sort of qualify that in the sense of, you know, not everybody likes or enjoys physical, you know, sport kind of activities, particularly competitive ones. But actually what the research says is it's valued activities. You know, they can be quiet, calming, not strenuous activities, but if they're valued, those help, and we can engage in them, those help our resiliency skills. And then the last bit is people, supportive social networks in terms of peers, adults in their lives, such as yourselves, and good family relationships. Okay. If you're interested in learning more of these, I can send on a link to our training session, which goes into this in a bit more detail. And another model, which I like, this comes from some research by Barnardo's. Although it's not sort of branded as a whole school model, I think it's really applicable as a whole school model in terms of how a context or a setting can support resilience. This splits resilience up into 6 different domains that if we have, you know, in a setting like a school, if we have things in place that promote these domains, we are more likely to have children and young people who develop resiliency skills. So for promote security, help teach social competencies, positive values, help cultivate someone's interests and talents. We support friendships, we support good education, which is what you're all about, Those things together can support resiliency skills. And what I guess I would say, thinking about that model of understanding, is, you know, this is a very positive focus, thinking about how can we help, but it might also tell us, if we just go back to the last slide, it also tells us something about why the problem's there as well. If we, you know, if you're thinking about a particular young person, you look at this model and think, I don't know which of these they've got, then those are big clues for us. First of all, in how we might build up their resiliency skills, and secondly, why they might be more vulnerable to the problem. Okay, so 2 ways of looking at this. Okay. So these are just those questions for that, you know, what I would call a whole school, whole setting response to resilience. Which when we talk to schools about this, you know, one of the things, I guess, around this model is to recognise all the great work you already do. You know, are there any you could amplify more? But recognising this is what a lot of schools are about. You already do lots of work supporting resilience. Okay, so I've given you a case study 2 ways. There's a link in the chat which I'm hoping works. If you click on it, it'll take you to a Google Drive document, and then I've sent everyone an email that should have got with that case study in, and what I'm going to do is put you into breakout rooms and ask you to read the case study to yourself, and then have a chat amongst yourselves to think about this child. This is I've chosen a primary age child, 9-year-old girl, and try to answer some of these questions, like why do you think this, what might have made this particular child vulnerable to the issues that you're going to read about? Are there any triggers? What might set off the difficulties? Are there any sort of what I might call maintenance factors? What might keep the problem going? And what do you see as strengths or areas you could build on strengths for them? Okay, I'm just going to look at the slide notes, unless I've got them up here. Just checking. No, that's not what I want to do. Oh dear. No, sorry, April. No, don't want to do that either. So I think we said, unless Ish can rescue me and tell me how long we said for this. Sorry, I like using up the time for the case study while I'm looking for the thing. Right, we said 15 minutes in your groups to have a chat with each other about this, and anything it triggers for you, you know, in a sense of, does this remind you of other stuff, or how do you as a setting work with these kind of issues? Again, thinking about your role as a mental health lead, not just your own personal, like what would you do in this situation, but think about how would this work if this was a child in school and I was consulted as a mental health lead. How would I support? Okay, so I'm going to create your rooms. You're going to be randomly assigned to a room. Ish, I think you're going to end up being shoved into a room, but you obviously can come out again. Does anyone, before I send you all off, does anyone not have the case studies? Anyone struggling with that? If you put your hand up, or has everyone got it? Okay. No hands are arriving. Oops, Jody doesn't have it. Anyone else? Sarah doesn't have it. Is that, I don't know if you can come on is that because the link doesn't work in the chat? Have you looked in the chat and found the link? Oh, have I sent the link? It might help if I actually click send. Right, just have a look in the chat now. Okay. Anyone else not have it? I can see some hands still up, but yeah, keep doing that. Are we ready? I'm building this up as a big thing, but it's not. I'm just gonna. So right, I'm gonna open up the rooms. In a sec. Just let me do this. Okay, so it's 20 past now. I'll close the rooms. I'll give you all a warning. I'll close the rooms in 15 minutes and bring everyone back. And if you can nominate like a spokesperson, we're going to go around the rooms and just have a little bit of feedback from people. Hi, Ish. I got your message. I'm going to what am I going to do? Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. I'm going to stop the breakout rooms now.
That's fine. Just sorry.
Are you okay? Do you need to?
Yeah, I just needed a 10 or 15 minutes. Kid that I work with has suddenly died, so
Oh no!
Really sad. Had a sudden heart failure. He had some medical issues anyway, but it's not something that was expected. So it's quite sad to be honest.
Yeah.
Quite sad to be honest. So I just had a couple of emails that I needed to send. Just need a bit of headspace to do that.
Sure. Well, do what you need to do, Ish. Honestly.
Yeah, I'm fine now. I think I'm okay.
Okay.
It's okay.
Right. I'll get them back in. Okay. Great. I think everyone's back. We could easily spend the rest of this session talking about this case study, which might be good use of time, I don't know. But I wanted to just invite someone from each group to speak to us, give a bit of feedback on how he found that exercise. And also, I guess, thinking about how whether that model was useful or not, how that might support kind of people's understanding of issues were you to think about that model with in your setting. So you can talk about Lily if you like. You can talk about using the model. Just want to hear from each group. So someone in group 1, would anyone like to volunteer?
Is that us, group 1? Are we group 1?
Group 1 was Lynn, Gemma, Catherine, and 2 other people whose names aren't coming up on here.
Oh yeah, that'll be us then. So we looked at Lily's case study. We thought she was emotionally based school avoidance, very clingy to mum. We felt like mum's anxiety would be rubbing off on her as she's trying all these different things. Very clingy to the teachers and TAs, which could indicate that something had also been going on at playtime, friendship wise. We thought Grandad's death might be linked if people hadn't explained the bereavement process and that link with mum's lengthy stay in hospital. She could just be a bit emotionally all over the place. And then we talked about dad's and mum's relationship, that the fact that they were arguing not in front of the children, but perhaps they weren't between them meeting her emotional needs. So then we looked at strategies, possibility of like people working with her, looking at a visual timetable, and that constant reassurance that mum will be picking her up at the end of school and that she's not going anywhere type of thing, and knowing for her to know when she's at home and when she's with grandma and granddad. We didn't know whether that was a bit of a movable feast and could confuse her a little bit. And then as a school, try and build up friendships, try and get her outside with friends, and then monitor whether there was an issue with anybody being mean to her. And we felt that she needed one-to-one time with the parents, possibly without Stephanie there. We considered whether Stephanie had additional needs linked to the horrific birthing experience, and whether you know, they spent a disproportionate amount of time meeting her needs, and she felt a little bit left out. So we thought we need to get somebody maybe to look at that relationship and the dynamics at home. And then just to try and get that morning situation better, to have somebody like your learning mentor or support worker meeting and greeting her in the morning and just checking in with her for 5 minutes. And then maybe at some stage either having some visual reminder with her of mum all day, or checking in with mum either through sort of the class dojo or maybe even a telephone conversation. So lots to unpick really.
Well,
but
yeah,
that was our conversation.
Fantastic. And how did you? I mean, you don't have to say what you like. was it helpful, I guess, to split things up? Because I guess you like you say, looks, you could sort of call it emotionally based school avoidance. Was it helpful then to look at layers of that, I guess?
Yeah, possibly. And we were saying if it's in real time, we're all finding a lot of issues like that post-COVID. They've been in that little bubble at home, and so we're finding in lots of schools in our little group that we are having children who are struggling to, even now, sort of a year and a bit on, to get back into that consistent routine of being here. We're finding lots of children off at the drop of a hat, and lots of parents letting them be off at the drop of a hat as well. I think they're quite liked having that other person at home and in that little bubble. So it is just breaking that cycle, really. And whilst mum's trying in Lily's situation all the different things like breakfast club and walking or whatever else, they can read your mood, can't they? I think if she's getting more and more anxious, that will be rubbing off, and that will be affecting her anxiety more. So yeah,
great, thank you. Yeah, so you've said such a lot there, but group 2, anyone want to add anything? That was Beverly, Lindsay, Kirsty, Jodie. How did you find this?
We pretty much did the same kind of thing. We looked at it as in a separation anxiety. We said the report was quite hard to follow. It would have been a lot better if it was in chronological order, because we said it talked about the fact that mum had been in hospital, and then that granddad had passed away and that she'd been into hospital. So we were saying, was it a concern that she thought mum wasn't going to come back? But then actually, if you looked at the years that they put it in, mum was in hospital before granddad passed away, so then that wouldn't have been so much of a concern. But then we looked at all the different things as well. It said about that she didn't like to go outside because she liked to make excuses or talk to the teachers at the time when it was meant to be going out. But then later on in the report, it also said that she was really good at going outside and enjoying playtime with her friends. But we just said the same kind of thing, really. Lots of separation anxiety. Is there a bit of inconsistency with the rules, social skills and friendship groups? Did we look at having meetings with mum, getting some buddy systems going, talking about getting parents to walk to school together if they possibly could, to try and make them feel happy coming into school? Was there any need for any parenting classes to be put forward? The same kind of things, really, is what's just been said, but obviously in our own way.
Thank you, Jodie. Great. Okay. I mean, I'll maybe make some comments overall, but group, just think about, wanted to hear from everyone. Group 3, that was Helen, Alison, Catherine. Who'd like to make some comment? Someone, please.
Do you want me to do it?
Yeah.
I don't know who's going to speak. I was kind of saying very similar to what people have said, but kind of one of the things which I kind of mentioned was where the teachers kind of said, what I picked up on about possible attention-seeking behaviours. And one of the things I said is I'm trained in Thrive as a Thrive practitioner, and we wouldn't use that. We would say the child is seeking a connection. Yeah. Which quite like, and the group quite liked that. And then I was kind of saying that there could be a little bit about parenting styles as well. You know, there could be like your dad sort of saying that mum's a little bit soft with her and things like that. So I think there's a bit of unpicking there. And about the grief, but not just for Lily, but for dad and the whole family as well, the impact of grief. And I was kind of saying, really, because I'm in a special school, we're quite lucky, I suppose, and I have worked in a mainstream primary as well, that we have got a school nurse who's 4 days a week. So I would be kind of probably doing a home visit with the school nurse and unpicking a little bit of the headaches and the feeling sick and things like that. And I suppose it depends where schools are at. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? Whereas I was asking my colleagues in mainstream, even though I've come out of mainstream 6 years ago, we used to have like a meeting with the school nurse once a week, but obviously that's changed now. When it's the head teacher was saying, sorry, I forgot your name, but she was head teacher on the screen. I forgot her name now. She was saying that it's usually email contact. That's the way it's gone with, you know, the school nurses and things like that. So that's where we were kind of up to. But if anybody wants to add anything, they can.
Thanks, Alison. Yeah, I think that's
all
something,
right.
you know, something additional, I guess you're saying there is recognizing that she's the girlies talk about health and feeling poorly, etc. And I suppose it's understanding that, I guess, adding that into the understanding that she might she probably is feeling sick.
Anxiety.
Yeah, it could be probably anxiety, but probably also needs ruling out that it isn't something else.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's unpicking it, isn't it, really? It's problem solving and unpicking it,
Yeah, and avoiding that jumping to conclusions that Thank you for that. Right, group 4. So that was Sarah, Vicky, Sarah, and again someone else whose name doesn't come up on my thing. Anything people want to add?
Just echoing what other people said. I think we picked up on the potential inconsistencies with parenting and the messages that mum and dad were giving, and you know that perhaps that needed some talking about and addressing. We thought perhaps triple P parenting to give some mum some more strategies for how to cope in the mornings and things. The thing that struck me as we were working through it is almost how useful all of that collated information was, which is slightly sort of off track, but as a school, why it's so important then to make sure that people are recording those concerns so you get that much clearer picture of need and issues. Yeah,
and I take the point. It wasn't in chronological order, but it's sort of, I wasn't trying to be difficult. It was more like often that is how we get stuff that you know, it's a bit of a jumble and we try and make sense of it. But you know, thank you for saying that, because I think that's a key point of this is, you know, there are obviously multiple perspectives here, and information from lots of different places, and the more we get, the better understanding we can gain.
But then having those layers of questioning against that information, you were able to kind of just evaluate a little bit more what the need was and how to move forward with it.
Yeah, because I guess some of the, I don't want to preempt group 5, but you know, people talked about grief, talked about, you know, some inconsistency about peer relationships. Is she you know, the really nice phrase, you know, about seeking connection and like why that might be, what's that need about. So there's lots of different avenues to go down here. The more we uncover. But anyway, let's hear from group 5 before I say any more. So that was Emma, Gary, Pauline, Mr. Owens, you've come up on here. Who would anyone like to add any more?
The only thing we discussed that hasn't been mentioned already would be around Lily's self-esteem. She's obviously a very capable little girl, and popular with her friends, but she doesn't have much self-belief, or doesn't feel that she does a good enough job with her work. It's also interesting that she doesn't have any, well, it seems as though she doesn't have any social engagement outside of school. You know, being part of additional communities outside of school is really important for your well-being, isn't it? So perhaps that might be playing part as well. But yeah, we spoke a lot about the separation anxiety, and one of my colleagues, I think it was Pauline, suggested a really nice idea to help with that. So I don't know if Pauline wants to share that with the group.
Go on, I will do.
Thank you.
Something that I've used before with the children in our setting is when they're really anxious, doing a nice activity So it's quite a tactile one. So you get some paint and you do handprints and you let the handprints dry. Obviously it's the child's handprints, and then the child will write a message on that hand for mum and dad, whoever, and then you would laminate it, and then the child goes home and gives the parent the handprint, and the parent can keep the handprint with them. The parent can do their own to give to the child, or on the other handprint, because they'd have a few, they could write a little message on, or they could put a love art on, and the child keeps that handprint with them in the pocket, and whenever they're having one of those worrying moments and they're missing the parent or whoever, they can just feel in the pocket, feel that that hand is there, and it does help the child to settle much easier. It's just something that we use, and it's proved successful time and time again. Well, I thought I'd share that with you.
Thank you, Pauline. Yeah, I mean, I would sort of call that a bit of like a grounding activity. You know, that it's sort of like put someone's mind onto like the here and now, and probably not onto the. I know I'm not want to like go too theoretical, because it just sounds a really nice thing. It's sort of a kind and compassionate thing that people can do for themselves, just as a reminder. But I suppose I'm thinking it's an emotional regulation tool as well, because it's probably taking them away from all those the scary thoughts, sort of predictions of what's going to go wrong and how awful things are going to be. So thank you for that. And if I'm looking at the fact that it's 5 to 12 and that the slides I'm not going to cover. I wanted to say something in the last couple of minutes about next session. If I just bring the slides back up, even if I can't, it doesn't matter actually. What we want to do in session 6 next week was to ask you to think about the stuff we talked about today. So between now and then, think about assessment, identification of need, monitoring of interventions in your setting, and what you do already and what you'd like to do. And related to that, you know, I think you've cued me in very nicely, Pauline, there. Sort of what are your strengths, successes, wins as a setting in terms of supporting children's mental health? And again, thinking about yourselves as the mental health leads, what do you want your systems to look like? How to identify young people's emotional health, mental health needs? What we'd really like on top of that is for some of you to have the floor for a couple of minutes and talk to everyone else about what you do well. So if any of you think actually we do this stuff well, you know, the stuff that Ish and I have talked about today, you know, we've got a system in place, or we've got processes that work well, you know, because one of the processes we want to have in this training is for you to learn from each other, you know, not just relying on Ish and myself to tell you everything, because you know you're all experienced people and you've all got stuff there. So have a think about what you'd want to develop based on what we've talked about, and also if you will have some space to hear from you about what you already do well, and we'd really like people to sort of take part in that. Okay. And then the last thing we're going to do in the last chunk of time next week is to try and bring everything together. So to have a bit of reflection on where has all this the stuff that we've talked about over the 6 sessions, where has this taken you as the mental health lead, and what are some actions that you're going to take as a in your setting to develop things a bit further. So I'm sorry I haven't covered the rest of the slides. I think they are probably self-explanatory. It's sort of moving a little bit on from thinking about Lily to like how you might address some of those needs. The last thing I'm going to do then is put the evaluation into the chat box. So if you could have a minute to fill that in, that would be lovely for us to hear how you found today's session. Any other, before we finish, any other thoughts or comments? Okay. No worries. If people need to go. If you could let us know what you think on that form, it only take a minute to, that would be lovely. So final reminder, we are live all together next week at County Hall. I can't remember, unless you can, Ish, the actual room we're in, but we will let you know. I'll send you an email to remind you. We're going to be on the floor, we always are, but I'm not exact. I can't remember off the top of my head the specific room we're in. We might have a couple of, well, I guess guests, new people, because there were some people who missed the session 6 last time. So we might have a couple of people there, if they can make it, who have done